What if I told you the innocent-looking cartoons of the 1960s weren't so innocent after all? Behind the colorful frames and cheerful songs were stories that scared censors, outraged parents, and got entire films pulled from theaters. These weren't harmless Saturday matinees, they were cultural flashpoints that made networks sweat. Which of these banned animations do you think your parents secretly watched before they vanished? Stick around, because one of the biggest surprises on this list isn't what you think it is. Yellow Submarine, 1968. It's hard to imagine a Beatles movie being controversial, but Yellow Submarine wasn't just a groovy trip through Pepperland, it was a psychedelic explosion that set off alarms across America. With its swirling colors, surreal landscapes, and mind-bending animation, the film screamed counterculture to parents who were already nervous about their kids listening to rock music. School districts in conservative states decided the film wasn't entertainment at all. They called it propaganda for the hippie movement. The Beatles were cultural icons, but in the 1960s, they were also lightning rods for controversy. When Yellow Submarine hit U.S. theaters, kids adored it, but critics claimed it promoted expanding the mind and other coded ideas tied to the era's youth rebellion. Some local school boards even banned screenings for children, saying it would confuse them and lead to strange thoughts. Imagine being told that a cartoon fish singing "All You Need Is Love" was dangerous. Censors were especially bothered by the film's dreamlike animation sequences, where logic broke down and characters drifted through abstract dimensions. Parents complained that kids came home babbling about seeing sounds and hearing colors. Whether those kids were just being imaginative or something more, the panic was real. Despite the backlash, the controversy only boosted the movie's cult status. For many, it became the ultimate example of how animation could push boundaries and challenge what kids' films were supposed to look like. Today, Yellow Submarine is hailed as a masterpiece. Back then, though, it was treated like a dangerous cartoon submarine floating into uncharted waters. Gay Purr-ee, 1962. At first glance, Gay Purr-ee looked like a charming family film. Judy Garland voiced Musette, a country cat who travels to Paris in search of sophistication. Sounds harmless enough, right? Except the movie leaned heavily into its Parisian setting, filling scenes with cabaret-inspired performances and smoky cafe sequences that made American censors deeply uncomfortable. Parents expected a wholesome story, but instead, they got a movie that winked a little too knowingly at adult nightlife. Animators included dance hall numbers with cats dressed in gowns and feathered headdresses strutting across Paris stages. In some conservative towns, theater owners flat out refused to screen the movie, claiming it was too suggestive for children. Newspapers at the time described it as a cartoon with questionable morals. That label was enough to sink it in certain markets. Adding fuel to the fire, the movie's villains lured Mussetto into Paris's darker corners, where the glamorous life came with dangerous strings attached. For parents of the 1960s who were still clinging to the image of cartoons as simple Saturday morning fun, this was too much. They didn't want their kids learning that cats in Paris could be tricked into bad decisions, especially when the animation style leaned so heavily into real-world cabaret culture. United Artists, the studio behind it, was blindsided. They had banked on Judy Garland's star power to sell the film, but the bans in several U.S. states crushed its box office momentum. Gay Purr-ee disappeared quickly, and for decades it was nearly forgotten. Ironically, the very thing that got it banned, its sophistication, is what makes it a fascinating relic today. It wasn't just another cartoon about singing animals, it was an animated Parisian drama that dared to act grown up. Mr. Magoo's 1001 Arabian Nights 1960. Everyone knew Mr. Magoo as the bumbling, nearsighted old man from Saturday morning shorts. So when producers decided to put him in a full-length feature, the idea was supposed to be a hit. Instead, Mr. Magoo's 1001 Arabian Nights ran into a cultural firestorm. The movie dropped Magoo into a fantasy version of the Middle East, filled with palaces, viziers, and exotic settings. The problem? It leaned on every stereotype in the book. Magoo, playing the role of Aladdin's uncle, wandered through caricatures of Eastern culture that critics said bordered on insulting. Characters spoke in exaggerated accents, women were drawn in cliches of mystery and veils, and villains were portrayed as bumbling despots obsessed with greed. In the tense political climate of the 1960s, when America's relationship with Middle Eastern nations was already complicated, the backlash was swift. Several community groups petitioned against the film, calling it disrespectful and damaging. Some theaters pulled it after opening week, particularly in urban centers with strong immigrant populations. Parents were also critical, saying the film sent confusing messages to children about entire cultures. Remember, this wasn't just about one joke or one character. The entire movie leaned on outdated ideas that clashed with a society starting to grapple with issues of representation. For Columbia Pictures, it was a disaster. They had hoped Magoo could carry a feature film, but instead the character was branded as outdated and offensive. The bans only sealed its fate. Today, animation historians look back on it as a cautionary tale of how easy it was for studios to stumble into controversy by turning cultural shorthand into cheap humor. What was supposed to be Magoo's big-screen triumph turned into the cartoon equivalent of walking blindly into a wall. Shinbone Alley, 1969. Now here's one you've probably never heard of, and there's a reason for that. Shinbone Alley was based on a Broadway musical, itself inspired by a series of newspaper columns. That origin alone made it unusual for an animated film. But the content? That's what really sank it. The movie told the story of Archie the cockroach and Mehitabel the alley cat, with heavy themes of disillusionment, city life, and broken dreams. It featured jazzy, offbeat musical numbers and dialogue that critics called too world-weary for children. Parents expecting a light-hearted cartoon about talking animals instead got characters lamenting their lives in smoky alleyways. Archie literally dies at the beginning, only to come back as a cockroach poet. That was enough to alarm censors who thought the themes were far too dark for a kid's audience. The film didn't shy away from edgy humor either. Scenes played with innuendo, jazz club slang, and references to nightlife that went straight over children's heads, but not over their parents. Several states refused to screen the movie, with theater boards declaring it unsuitable for minors. It wasn't an official nationwide ban, but it was death by 1,000 cuts. With enough local rejections, the film couldn't sustain a national release. To make matters worse, critics panned it, calling it confusing and tone-deaf. Box office numbers tanked, and Shinbone Alley vanished almost as soon as it arrived. For years, it became one of those whispered-about lost films, the kind parents remembered as too strange or too inappropriate. Today, it survives mostly as a curiosity, proof that the late 1960s really was a time when animation was starting to test its limits, sometimes to disastrous results. The Man Called Flintstone, 1966. You'd think a spin-off of the Flintstones would be bulletproof. After all, the original show was a cultural phenomenon. But The Man Called Flintstone wasn't just another romp in bedrock. It was a full-blown spy parody released at the height of the Cold War, and that turned out to be a problem. In the film, Fred Flintstone is mistaken for a secret agent and sent on a mission across Europe. Sounds funny enough, but critics at the time said it blurred the line between comedy and propaganda. Some southern U.S. theaters banned it outright, arguing that the movie's spy villains played too close to Cold War stereotypes. Local officials claimed it was inappropriate to expose children to subversive material disguised as entertainment. Parents were also unsettled by how much of the humor depended on political paranoia. The villains, while silly, were clearly modeled after Eastern Bloc spies. The gags about espionage, double agents, and secret weapons hit too close to home in a decade when school kids were literally practicing nuclear drills. Suddenly, Fred Flintstone was no longer a harmless caveman dad, but a cartoon symbol caught up in world politics. Hanna-Barbera defended the movie as just another spoof, pointing to the popularity of James Bond parodies at the time. But the controversy limited its reach. Some towns pulled it after a single weekend, leaving confused kids to wonder why their favorite Stone Age family had been yanked from the marquee. Ironically, the movie has aged into a quirky time capsule, reflecting both the spy craze of the 1960s and the paranoia that surrounded it. For Fred Flintstone, trading his club for a briefcase turned out to be more than just a career change. It was a cultural gamble that didn't pay off. Yellow Submarine Singalong. If the original Yellow Submarine stirred controversy, the 1969 Singalong re-release poured gasoline on the fire. The idea was simple: add on-screen lyrics so kids could join in the Beatles hits. But here's the catch. The sing-along sequences emphasized the film's most psychedelic scenes, stretching them into longer, trippier montages. For conservative parents already nervous about the Beatles, this was the final straw. In certain U.S. towns, school boards and church-led parent groups picketed screenings, calling the sing-along a gateway to strange behavior. The swirling, kaleidoscopic visuals paired with lyrics like "Turn off your mind," "Relax," and "Float downstream," lines from the Beatles' wider catalog, only added fuel to the accusations. Even though those lyrics weren't in the film itself, the association was strong enough that critics claimed the sing-along was coded encouragement for kids to drift away from reality. The backlash was immediate. Some theaters canceled the screenings mid-run after angry letters poured in, while others refused to book the sing-along cut entirely. Ironically, those same theaters happily played the original version without subtitles, as if kids couldn't still hum along. The absurdity wasn't lost on Beatles fans who mocked the bands as proof the establishment had no sense of humor. For kids who did see it, though, the sing-along became legendary. They weren't just watching a movie, they were part of it, shouting out lyrics in crowded theaters, making the whole thing feel like a rock concert. Censors may have tried to shut it down, but in the end, the controversy only deepened Yellow Submarine's counterculture reputation. What was meant as a family-friendly re-release became another flashpoint in the battle over what animation could be. Hey there, it's Yogi Bear. 1964, everyone's favorite picnic basket thief, made his big screen debut in Hey There, It's Yogi Bear. The movie seemed like a sure thing. Slapstick gags, a catchy theme song, and the beloved duo of Yogi and Boo Boo. But almost as soon as it hit theaters, some parents declared it morally corrupt. Why? Because Yogi Bear wasn't just stealing sandwiches, he was getting away with it. In the 1960s, children's entertainment was expected to reinforce good behavior. Yogi's schemes to outsmart Ranger Smith and trick campers into handing over food didn't sit well with parents who thought kids would copy him. In fact, reports surfaced of children sneaking into kitchens and joking that they were pulling a Yogi. Suddenly, a silly bear was being blamed for bad manners across America. The controversy didn't stop at picnic baskets. Critics pointed out that the movie portrayed authority figures like Ranger Smith as clueless, bumbling fools. In a decade where respect for authority was a cultural battleground, some censors argued the film was undermining social order. Certain towns in the South and Midwest even banned screenings altogether, calling it unfit for minors. Imagine trying to explain to a kid that they couldn't watch a cartoon because the bear was too sneaky. Hanna-Barbera tried to defend the film, saying Yogi always faced consequences in the end. But let's be honest, audiences remembered the clever escapes, not the punishments. While the bans were scattered and short-lived, they cemented Yogi's reputation as more than just a mischievous bear. He was suddenly a cartoon outlaw, a symbol of defiance, hiding behind a goofy grin. For parents, he was trouble. For kids, he was hilarious. And that divide was exactly why the film landed in hot water. A Boy Named Charlie Brown, 1969. Before the world fell in love with the Peanuts gang on the big screen, A Boy Named Charlie Brown had a rocky start. During early test screenings in 1969, parents and school officials raised alarms over how the movie handled bullying. Scenes showed Charlie Brown being humiliated in spelling bees, ignored by his peers, and dismissed by adults. For many, it hit too close to home. Instead of inspiring sympathy, Critics argued the movie normalized bullying. Teachers complained that kids laughed at Charlie Brown's failures instead of feeling sorry for him. In some test markets, schools outright banned field trip screenings, claiming the film taught cruelty by making fun of a child's struggles. The backlash was so strong that producers briefly considered shelving the entire release. But the controversy didn't stop there. Peppermint Patty's introduction as a brash, tough-talking new character raised eyebrows too. Some parents thought her treatment of Charlie Brown crossed the line into outright verbal abuse. In the late 1960s, when debates about child development were growing louder, critics argued that showing kids laughing at Charlie Brown's misery was harmful. Eventually, the movie made it to wide release, but not before significant edits and rewrites softened some of the harshest scenes. Even then, a handful of school districts refused to let it play in classrooms or local theaters, marking it as unsuitable for younger children. Ironically, the very thing that worried adults, Charlie Brown's resilience in the face of failure, is what gave the film lasting power. Today, it's remembered as a touching portrait of perseverance. But in 1969, before anyone knew how audiences would embrace it, a boy named Charlie Brown was treated as a banned lesson in cruelty. The Adventures of Pow-Wow, 1960. By the early 1960s, TV shorts of The Adventures of Pow-Wow had already stirred controversy. So when producers compiled them into a theatrical feature, the backlash doubled. The movie followed a Native American boy named Pow-Wow and his animal friends in a mishmash of Western-themed adventures. It was marketed as educational, but what kids actually got was a parade of stereotypes. Pow-Wow spoke in broken English, lived in a teepee regardless of the setting, and solved problems through ancient wisdom that often boiled down to smoke signals and talking animals. Worse, the animation mixed tribal imagery from completely different cultures, lumping everything into one generic Indian identity. Native American groups immediately denounced the film, calling it insulting and damaging. The National Congress of American Indians labeled it cultural erasure, and protests outside theaters pressured distributors to pull the movie in major cities. Some stations even refused to air Pow-Wow reruns after the film controversy exploded, marking it as untouchable. Parents of Native children argued the cartoon reinforced harmful stereotypes in classrooms, undoing real progress in schools trying to teach accurate history. Producers tried to spin the backlash by saying Pow-Wow was a role model, but few bought it. When veterans groups, many of them Native Americans who had served in World War II and Korea, spoke out, the controversy escalated. They pointed out the irony of serving their country only to see their heritage mocked on Saturday mornings and the silver screen. The compilation film quietly disappeared from circulation soon after. Today, it's remembered less as a piece of animation and more as an example of how badly the industry mishandled representation. What was pitched as cultural education ended up banned as cultural distortion. Shinbone Alley's Roadshow Cut, 1969. As if Shinbone Alley didn't already struggle with bans, the so-called Roadshow Cut took things to another level. This version, pieced together for traveling screenings in smaller cities, leaned even harder into the film's nightlife themes. Promoters tried to sell it as a more grown-up cartoon, complete with longer alley sequences, jazz club dialogue, and risque musical numbers that pushed it far outside family territory. Parents who had already been wary of the original went into full panic mode. Reports of rowdy late-night screenings circulated, where teenagers treated the cartoon more like a rebellious outing than a family film. Local censors pounced, banning the roadshow version in multiple states under the label unfit for minors. The edits didn't make the film better either. Instead, they made it more confusing as serious scenes dragged on, and characters like Mehitabel the Alley Cat were portrayed with even heavier undertones of world-weary drama. Reviewers called it animation having an identity crisis, unsure if it was supposed to be for kids, adults, or nobody at all. The bans effectively killed the movie's second life. While the original Shinbone Alley had at least a small cult following, the Roadshow Cut was treated as a joke, a desperate attempt to salvage box office returns by courting controversy. Instead, it just fueled more protests and ensured the film never made it beyond a handful of markets. Today, only scraps of the roadshow edits survive, but its reputation lingers. In the end, the attempt to repackage an already risky movie into something even edgier only guaranteed it would be banned faster. It's a classic example of how doubling down on controversy sometimes just digs the grave deeper. Magoo's Adventures, 1964. Columbia Pictures tried to cash in on Mr. Magoo's popularity by stitching together a collection of shorts into a feature-length package called Magoo's Adventures. On paper, it seemed like easy money. But when parents and advocacy groups took a closer look, the project turned into a nightmare. The problem wasn't Magoo himself, it was the content of the shorts they bundled. Many were built on tired stereotypes that might have passed unnoticed in the 1950s, but landed like a grenade in the mid-1960s. There were caricatures of Chinese laundrymen, bumbling Oriental shopkeepers, and exaggerated accents that made even critics wince. Instead of a harmless comedy, the movie played like a highlight reel of offensive cliches. Audiences weren't amused. In New York and San Francisco, theaters pulled the film after protests from Asian American organizations. Parents argued that presenting these shorts under the banner of family entertainment wasn't just outdated, it was damaging. Even school boards that sometimes used cartoons as educational filler declared Magoo off-limits. Columbia Pictures scrambled for damage control, issuing statements about Magoo being a product of his time. But the excuses fell flat. The bans in key urban markets killed any hope of wide success. What was supposed to be Magoo's victory lap instead highlighted how quickly American culture was shifting. The once beloved character now symbolized the industry's blind spots. Today, Magoo's Adventures is mostly forgotten, but the story of its bans lingers as a reminder. Sometimes a studio's nostalgia trip can turn into a public relations disaster. Magoo walked blindly into walls, but this time it was Columbia that tripped over its own past. Yellow Submarine Reels, 1968. Before Yellow Submarine officially launched, select theaters tested out preview reels to build buzz. What was supposed to be a harmless marketing gimmick backfired in spectacular fashion. These reels highlighted the most experimental sequences, the psychedelic sea of holes and nowhere man scenes stripped of context. Parents who saw the previews complained that the visuals looked like hallucinations set to pop music. Without the full story of the Beatles saving Pepperland, the clips came across as pure surrealism. Rumors spread that the movie was designed to hypnotize children. In conservative areas, local authorities banned the previews outright. One newspaper described them as moving art designed to scramble young minds. The backlash forced some theaters to cancel the preview reels altogether, while others swapped them for traditional trailers. Ironically, the controversy only fueled kids' curiosity. Stories circulated of children begging their parents to take them to see the weird Beatles cartoon that adults didn't want them to watch. By the time the full film premiered, the damage was done. In certain towns, entire school boards advised parents against taking children, citing the preview reels as proof of confusing content. Instead of selling the movie, the reels had branded it dangerous. Looking back, it's almost funny. The sequences that got it banned are now hailed as brilliant animation experiments. But in 1968, when parents were already terrified of youth culture slipping away from them, those preview reels became Exhibit A in the case against psychedelic cartoons. Mad Monster Party? 1967. Rankin Bass, the studio famous for cozy holiday specials like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, shocked everyone with Mad Monster Party. Instead of heartwarming cheer, this stop-motion movie gave audiences ghouls, skeletons, and monsters throwing an outrageous party. Kids expected Santa Claus vibes. What they got felt more like a Halloween fever dream. The problem wasn't just the creepy visuals, it was the tone, Characters cracked dark jokes, zombies lurched across the screen, and scenes leaned into horror tropes that were downright unsettling for younger audiences. Parents flooded local censors with complaints that the movie was too scary for children. Some theaters reclassified it as unsuitable for matinees, while others banned it outright from family programming. Adding fuel to the fire, the film didn't offer the comforting moral lessons parents expected. Instead, the story reveled in chaos, with monsters plotting, bickering, and behaving badly. Kids loved the outrageousness, but adults saw it as glorifying mischief without any consequences. Critics at the time labeled it rankin bass gone rogue, accusing the studio of trying to capitalize on monster culture without considering the impact. In certain southern and midwestern towns, bans were swift. Theater boards argued it was too disturbing for children, especially since the promotional posters made it look like a family-friendly cartoon. Parents walked into theaters expecting Rudolph-style sweetness and walked out demanding refunds. Today, Mad Monster Party has a cult following among horror fans who adore its weird mix of spooky and silly. But in the 1960s, it became one of the few animated features to get banned for being too frightening. It proved that even puppets could scare the living daylights out of censors. The Incredible Mr. Limpet, 1964. You probably know The Incredible Mr. Limpet as that oddball hybrid film where Don Knotts turns into a talking fish to help the U.S. Navy fight submarines. Half live-action, half animation, it seemed like harmless family entertainment. But buried inside the animated sequences was enough controversy to get the movie banned in certain markets. The problem wasn't the comedy, it was the wartime messaging. The animated Limpet doesn't just swim around and crack jokes, he actively helps the Navy sink enemy submarines, complete with explosions and cheering sailors. For censors in the mid-1960s, blending cartoon fun with military violence crossed a line. Parents complained that the movie turned warfare into slapstick, making destruction look like a game. Some critics also objected to the surreal tone of the animated sequences. The transformation scene where Knotts becomes a fish with bulging eyes, shimmering colors, and dreamlike animation unsettled young viewers. Reports trickled in of children having nightmares, which only added to the backlash. Local boards in parts of the Midwest and on the East Coast yanked the film, calling it unsuitable for minors due to its mix of fantasy and warfare. Warner Brothers defended the film, arguing it was patriotic and lighthearted. But the bans chipped away at its box office momentum, relegating it to a quirky footnote in animation history. Ironically, the very elements that got it banned, the surreal animation and wartime satire, are what make it so fascinating today. In the end, The Incredible Mr. Limpet proved that even a cartoon fish could find himself in hot water. What was supposed to be family-friendly comedy turned into one of the decade's strangest examples of banned animation. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, 1966. Believe it or not, even the beloved How the Grinch Stole Christmas had its share of controversy. While it's now considered untouchable holiday tradition, its very first broadcasts in 1966 drew unexpected pushback. Some school districts and local stations refused to air it, claiming the Grinch's antics were too mean-spirited for children. Parents complained that the Grinch broke into homes, stole gifts, and terrorized an entire town, without facing any real punishment until the very end. Critics argued that young viewers might miss the redemption arc and instead take away the idea that wrecking Christmas was funny. Letters poured into networks from parents who said their children were frightened rather than entertained. In a few conservative towns, the backlash escalated into outright bans. Local boards declared the special unfit for children's holiday programming, leading to its removal from schedules. In parts of the Midwest and South, imagine being told you couldn't watch The Grinch because he was too good at being bad. Of course, the bans didn't last. The special's critical acclaim and enduring popularity quickly overshadowed the complaints. But those early reactions show just how sensitive audiences were in the 1960s. What we now see as a heartwarming tale of redemption was, in its debut, treated like a dangerous lesson in holiday mischief. The irony? The very thing that frightened parents, the Grinch's bold, unapologetic badness, is what made him unforgettable. Sometimes being banned is just the first step to becoming a classic. And there you have it, 15 animated films from the 1960s that censors and parents tried to erase. From psychedelic Beatles journeys to scary monster parties, from cabaret cats to cranky green Christmas thieves, these movies pushed boundaries far beyond what audiences expected from cartoons. Which of these shocked you the most? Did your parents ever tell you about seeing one before it disappeared? Drop your stories in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and get ready, because the wildest animation tales are still ahead.